Hi, I'm looking forward to having this conversation about pivoting towards our best selves in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic. Such an interesting topic, and one that I think everyone talks about in some way or another, whether it's a surface discussion about a fact or what the latest news is, or whether or not they wear a mask, or sometimes it's the more deep discussion about what does this mean for us? How has it changed me so far? What does it mean for the future? Is there a normal that we're coming back to, or is it going to be different in all the ways? It's an interesting conversation to have, and I think one that, on a deeper level, can really bring light to who we are, how we live each day, crisis or not, and what we see going forward. So a couple of things when I was thinking about the title of pivoting towards, I thought, oh my gosh, let's look up the word pivoting. And I find it interesting because, when we think of pivoting, I think of like on my heel, I'm turning from this area to this area. My body is pivoting from one side to another. And indeed, that's part of the definition. What I found really surprising and cool, actually, is that pivot can also mean to depend on. And if you take out the word pivoting towards our best selves and put in depending on our best selves, it kind of brought me to the question of, do I depend on myself? Who do I depend on? Do I depend on God? And all of these questions come up in that little thought of pivot, depend on. Of course, that's the definition that I was kind of drawn to, because a lot of the work that I do is in regards to presence, and presence specifically with people who are at the end of their lives, no matter what age they are, those with terminal illness, loss, grief, reflection on the whole death and dying experience. And so I started to think about, in the word presence, we're looking at this fact of existence, of occurring or being present in a place or present with people. And sometimes in these most intimate times of life, presence can even bring on a deeper meaning for us, where we have almost a spiritual experience of presence. And how beautiful, how intimate that can be. So in presence, that being there, that fully aware experience with others, I think is an interesting one, because we have been in this pandemic asked to stay in our place, in our home, in our town, in our state, in our country. And we have probably been more present with ourselves and possibly family, loved ones, dear friends, if we've chosen, more present to ourselves and others than we have for a very, very, if ever, a very long time. And that brings about an interesting conversation, in my mind at least, of, am I present with who I am? Am I present to others in the way that I wish to be? Am I present to God? Am I present to nature? And how do I how do I experience being present with myself? Not only all those other things, but within myself. Pure presence, I think, in the moment, whatever moment it may be. And in moments, I think of, small snippets of time. One moment going to the next and then the next. But pure presence with ourselves, with others, with God, we have this potential to become and evolve into our best self, our best experience of ourselves. And in each new moment, that starts again. So to me, that seems very much the same with the word pivot. And I use the word become there as well. And I find the word become very intriguing because I think of, sometimes people hear the word becoming and they think of, a person is very becoming, or I am going to become a doctor, or I'm going to become a nurse. To me, the word becoming is this constant evolution of who we are from one moment to the next and to the next. And that becoming, that evolving, and the awareness of that really allows us to live in that pure presence that we were just talking about. Many of you are probably very familiar with Brother Lawrence. And I wasn't as familiar as I wish I had been upon hearing the story of Brother Lawrence, but have become much more familiar recently. And I feel really lucky to have learned about his book, The Practice of the Presence of God. One of the things that the book talks about, that Brother Lawrence would talk about, is God's nearness. And one of the quotes that it was really just sung to me upon reading it was, "You need not cry very loud. He is nearer to us than we think." And how beautiful. How beautiful that when we think about presence, when we're in a crisis, in a pandemic, and whatever, all the usual things that are happening in life anyway, with this then laid on top of it, that there may only be but a veil that we can't even see through, that God's presence is right there for us. And I find that the same as that word pivoting, because we may not even need to pivot but a small bit, from here to maybe even here, to see through that veil. We may not even be aware what small movement in that moment might be required for us to just see things differently and to be more present to life differently. And I just am overwhelmed with the beauty of that. How simple that can be. Sometimes we make it much more difficult. But again, that quote, "You need not cry very loud. He is nearer to us than we think." That pivot doesn't need to be very much. And we can see things totally differently in that small change, in that small moment, in that small experience of becoming. One of the things that I think is interesting to touch on during this time in our world, and that I've heard this reflected in people's concerns and worries about the pandemic, when things, if they do, return to what we might consider normal life, that there is this unsettling unknown because we don't know. We don't know. And that brings about fear for people. And that fear can be almost immobilizing. And most certainly can disturb that beauty of presence that we're talking about. I can't help but wonder if we recognize the continual becoming of our lives from one moment to the next, from one little pivot to the next, from one moment of presence to the next. That if we're able to recognize that, would the fear feel or look differently, or maybe not even exist at all? And I say this because of some experience with working with people at the very end of their lives, the very end, with those final breaths. And when there is absolute pure presence and peace in that most intimate time, and comfort, there is usually no fear. And sometimes there are outlying experiences, of course, but most often that fear subsided weeks ago, days ago, hours ago. And while that whole discussion on becoming might seem so simple and exaggerated, again, I'll quote Brother Lawrence, actually, because it's just so poignant. When he says, "There is not in the world a kind of life more sweet and delightful than that of a continual conversation with God. Those only can comprehend it who practice and experience it." And how lovely to focus on that continual conversation. That continual conversation with God is a continual presence in looking towards God, is a continual becoming. It's a continual pivot. It's being so in the moment of experiencing that continual conversation. What more sweet could there be? What more delightful, as he said? What more beautiful? And amidst all of the negativity that I think we hear today in news reports, true or false, if we look towards pivoting towards our best selves from this day forward, that presence is going to be key. That presence to each moment, that presence to others, that presence to ourselves, that presence to God. And I think we can almost feel the need to be drawn towards that, to depend on, to pivot. And why don't we? You know, it's like the magnet just is drawing, being drawn in, that force just, you know, for us to trust that, for us to trust being in that moment and allow that pure love and presence to guide us. It can only guide us towards happiness and well-being. And sometimes I get asked the question as well, well, there's so many people have died. So many people have passed due to this virus. And yes, that's so true. And it's tragic. And I imagine that the presence of their breaths can teach us so much. To teach us to live, to teach us to find that beauty in each moment, and to teach us how to move forward. So, if we look at our theme for this whole summit, that pivoting towards our best selves, we all have such potential to do just that. And the possibilities within that are endless. They are purely right there for us, like that veil we talked about. We can't see through that veil, but it's there. And I think for us to find the courage to look for that is so important at this time, and to have the conversations and to truly go deep with it. I think that's where we'll find the most peace and a feeling of absolute love and presence with each other. And that will inform everything else we do as we return back to life, and work and play, in raising our children, in everything that we do. That will inform it all. I look forward to talking with you more about this. And I'd like to thank Christina Simmons for putting all this together through Say Yes to Holiness. And we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.